Hello and welcome to the first proper video on my King Paramount channel. As you may be able to tell soon, I am in a boatyard, which means that there'll be certain amounts of noises off throughout this video, but that's just the way that it is. I thought I'd start out by talking about the most important part about buying a boat, and that is making sure that you have a good hull. You see, the problem is that the number of boats on the canal has exploded recently, from about 10,000 at its peak in the industrial age to 35,000 now, which means that between about 1995 and about 2010, lots and lots and lots of boats were built, and many of them were of excellent quality, and some of them were of terrible quality. And the problem is you can't tell from how nice they are inside how good the steel was that was used to build the boat, and some boats used appalling quality steel. So let's have a little walk around of my boat, Utopia Limited, and have a look and see what makes a good hull and what problems you might find. So first things first, nearly all canal boats are built out of mild steel. That is to say, iron with a small amount of carbon and a couple of other bits and bobs added. Now that's easy to work and it's easy to weld and it's reasonably cheap, but it does rust. And rust is the biggest problem that is going to affect your boat, and indeed my boat. And boats rust in basically one of two different modes. The first one is they react with water to form iron oxide, and you get a sheet of rust over the whole surface of the metal, which will then fall off in great big flakes like terrible orange dandruff. This mostly affects the bottom, the base plate of boats, but what it does is essentially thins out the steel in a uniform manner. So something which starts out 10mm thick will end up being 6mm thick. The second type of corrosion which affects boats is electrochemical corrosion. Now the way that works is if you are plugged into 240 volt power supply, for example on the shore, then some of that current is going to leak into the earth, or in this case the canal. What that does is, if you've ever done that experiment at school where you put two iron nails into a beaker of salty water and then pass a current through them, the nails get rusty, and what happens is essentially the water breaks up into hydrogen and oxygen, and the oxygen reacts with the iron to form iron oxide. This is a very, very slow process over years and years and years, but what it does do is it causes little pits in the steel, and I'll see if I can put up a brief video of some pitted steel here so you can see roughly what it looks like. Now, there's three things that people do to try and limit the amount of rusting and pitting that goes on in their boats. The first one is, if you're connected to shore power, you would want to install a galvanic isolator, which goes between the shore power and the hull of the boat and tries to stop as much current as possible from leaking into the canal. The second thing you might want to do is you might want to install anodes. Anodes look like this, and they are made out of magnesium, and they, at least on a canal they are, and they're welded to a boat, and they gradually corrode in preference to the iron. So they're more reactive than iron, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller, but the iron doesn't. And eventually they get really small, like this, and they need replacing. So that's something to look at whenever you take your boat out of the water. But the most important way of protecting a boat from corrosion is simply to cover it in as much paint as possible, a physical barrier between the steel and the water. Now, there are two sorts of paint which get used on the hulls of boats. The first one is bitumen paint. That's the sort which I will be using, and it's very cheap and very easy to put on, and you just slap it on and wait for it to dry, and it forms a sort of semi-hard covering over the metal. So if you scrape it, it will to a certain extent smear over the surface rather than fracture and crack and fall off in flakes. The problem with it is that it doesn't work for a particularly long time. It's relatively easy to scrape off, and so you need to have the boat out of the water every 2 years and replace it with some more bitumen paint. Your other option is much more expensive, but frankly better, and that is 2-pack epoxy, which is a mixture of paint and glue, and you have to spray it onto shiny bare metal. So you have to have the whole boat shot blasted or sand blasted, and you spray it onto that and it sticks really, really well, and that will last for quite a few years, 5, 6, 7 years even. Now, The only problem with that is, one, it's very, very expensive, and two, if you hit the side of the canal really hard, you might end up cracking the paint, and then you might then leave it for 5 years before you then look at it again. So I prefer to use bitumen, it's cheaper, and I like to have the boat out of the water every couple of years anyway. Now, just one quick thing before we talk about ways of remediating damage to hulls, and that is painting the base plate. You should definitely paint the base plate. A lot of places will tell you they won't or they can't, and they'll come up with excuses why you don't need to, which are broadly, 1, there's no oxygen in the canal, in which case how do fish breathe, or 2, it gets rubbed off anyway as you scrape along the bottom, like how careless are you being with your boat, and 3, the base plate is really thick, so it'll take ages to rust through, to which I say I want my boat to last as long as possible. So I would always paint the base plate and always go to a place that will do it for you, or at least put your boat on high enough chocks that you can do it yourself. Now, let's say your boat does have damage. The easiest place to find it is probably along the waterline, which is the bit where water meets air, meets places where the paint's been scraped off, and so that's the most likely to rust first. And if you are buying a boat, you are unlikely to be able to see it out of the water unless you spend a lot of money on having it pulled out of the water to look at it. So one thing you might want to do is to get down on your hands and knees and run your fingers along the waterline and see if there's any massive pits there. It won't tell you if a boat is good, but it will tell you if a boat is bad, so it's worth doing. So option 1 is to have a welder come along and fill in all the pits with weld, which is a good solution, but it takes ages and it's very expensive and you can't get all the pits. But it is worth doing if you've got a couple of big pits. Option 2 is to have the metal cut out and a new plate welded in, which is the absolutely gold standard option, but if you imagine having to do that to the entire base plate of a boat, I mean, it would be significantly more expensive than just buying another shell and transferring all your stuff into it. And then option 3 is the most contentious one, which is overplating. And here's a clip of some overplating here, where you basically just weld new metal over the top of the old metal. Now, you could do this well, or you can do this badly. So if you do it well, you drill holes in the metal and you plug weld through, and you make sure that all of your welds are absolutely brilliantly done and there's no pinholes in any of them. And if you do it badly, then you just slap a plate over the top, weld around it and hope for the best. All of which means that water gets behind it and carries on rusting through the boat without you noticing. So my advice would be, if you do want to overplate a boat, get it done by a very, very good welder, and never buy a boat that's been overplated because you have no idea whether it's been done well or not, and no means of telling. So, what I'm going to do to this boat is, the hull is in very good condition actually, as I think I've said before. So what we're going to do is we are going to pressure wash all of the mud and the scug off it like this, and then we are going to have it painted in a couple of coats of bitumen, including on the bottom, like this. And then it will be ready to be craned back into the canal, like this. And that's us back in the water and ready to go again for more adventures. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, and even if you haven't, please do subscribe, and I'll be back soon with some more videos of a middle-aged man whittering on about canal boats. Goodbye.